Missions. You're the only one. Thank you for coming to do that. I want to ask. Just a little bit, Creator, to look after our people. You know, all cultures, everybody in this world, all living things, two-leggeds, four-leggeds, wingeds, you know, everybody. You each go missions. Today we ask that you bless each and every one of the people sitting in this circle, that they have a good meeting, a good way to look at themselves and look forward to the future with positive attitudes. We ask you to help us in this endeavor that we're about to embark on the missions. Jimmy, you go coming to the man, missions. You know, Nishka gonna get to him. Hey, my name is Man of the Earth. That's what I'm known as to my Creator as well as my people. Thank you for coming to sit with us and show us the way. Help us. Blessing. Ask a blessing for each and every one of us here in the circle today. Go in and win the gun. I'll sing one song, short song, and then we'll carry on with the meeting. Thank you for coming to sit with us today. Guide us in your beautiful wisdom. Jimmy Greek, thank you very much for listening. And we'll carry on with the meeting now.
Hand to heart and Chimagwich, Elder Wallace, for bringing us into this space in a really amazing way.
Thank you for using my language.
You're welcome. And that is also thank you in the Anishinaabe territory, just outside of Ottawa and Gatineau, where I spent a lot of time before coming to Calgary. So so good to see everyone today. I got a note to introduce myself as well. My name is Megan Reed. I'm the Executive Director at Vibrant Communities Calgary. And it's okay if you don't know that organization, but we do hope you know Enough for All, which is the poverty reduction strategy for our collective city in Mohkinstsis or Calgary. And we are just so glad that you could join us today. I'm going to start off with some housekeeping. So first of all, just make sure that if you're not speaking, you are on mute, or we might mute you. I think a couple of us in this room have that power. And if we encourage chat, so we'll be keeping an eye on the chat section over on the right. So please make sure to use that liberally. Give us your thoughts. And we will have questions and answers at the end. But if you do have questions, please post them there so you can sort of get other people thinking as well. We're really happy to be joining again for the 369 series hosted by our pioneering champion, Calgary Reads. So Calgary Reads was the champion kind of responsible for making sure that early learning was embedded and in the forefront of the Enough for All strategy. And one thing, Elder Wallace, I love that you said, was about, sort of meeting our future with really positive intent and gratitude. And when we think about families and literacy, that's sort of what that means. One thing that Stacy once said to me once upon a time when we could eat sandwiches in person was that if we look at our community as a collective family, as adults, we should all be talking to children all the time. And Stacy, that never really left me, And when I think about the Indigenous perspective on family, there's the family in your house, or maybe not always in your house, but then there's also our collective family together as a community. And so I kind of want us to keep that in mind today as we hear from our great speaker. But first, I'm going to pass it over to the amazing Stacy Finney at Calgary Reads to introduce what's next for us in our time together.
Thank you, Megan. I hope that everyone remembers that talk is cheap, it's free, and it is something that we should be doing all the time with all those little people in our lives, in the grocery store, everywhere we go. So thank you for remembering that it's a good thing to talk to little ones. That is a perfect introduction to what 369 is. Some of you have heard me talk about this a lot. And for the sake of people who this might be your first session, I just want to put some context around why we call this the 369 series. We at Calgary Reads have long loved collaborative endeavors, and we used to incubate the First 2000 Days Network, which was a very important network focused on those 0 to 5 years, first 2000 days of a child's life. And we also convened the grade level reading campaign, which was committed to ensuring that every child was reading by 3rd grade, which is an incredibly important milestone for success in life. And both of those coalitions, like Can Happen, were not resourced in the way that they needed to be. They proved not sustainable, and they were evaporating even before COVID. So 369 is our attempt, but the work has gotten more important than ever. And certainly I think we all know that where dollars flow doesn't necessarily mean that's where the greatest need is. We still believe there is an important dialogue to be had in our community about children and families, and that just because these two structures no longer exist doesn't mean that we weren't responsible to be a guardian to children. And so the 369 is the new version of this very important long time work. And essentially it means we are still attending to not just the first 2000 days, but the first 8 years of life, which are really those early years for a child. The 3 stands for the important data that can be gleaned through a program like Lena, which we are running throughout the city, where the vocabulary that a child is exposed to is actually being collected through a digital device that can record the number of words, the number of conversational turns. And we're hoping to scale Lena across our community and get data that gives us an understanding of how can data and programming together really help change the way in which a parent talks with their child. So at age 3, the number of words a child has an incredible predictor to how they're going to land at school. So the 6 represents that grade 1 child who's learning how to read. And we're really excited to have the inklings of some data collection that's going to happen with the Calgary Board of Education that is really going to identify those children at risk of being that struggling reader. And then when a child turns 9, they're heading into grade 4. And we do and are part of an international assessment on grade 4 reading levels internationally. And we want to ensure before kids leave this learning to read time of their life to suddenly needing to read to learn for the rest of it, that they are on track to succeed. So 369 represents these very critical developmental milestones and important places where we believe some data could be captured to tell a really rich and robust language and literacy story within our local community context. We are a proud lever just developing under the Enough for All strategy. And I hope by the time the next series comes, we'll have a little bit more information about what else we hope to achieve under and within the lever of the Enough for All strategy. A child growing up in poverty is hearing millions of fewer words when they are young, millions of fewer words. And it's very difficult to catch up. It's just, in many cases, not even possible without this complete immersion of words within their life. So 369, stay tuned as we come forth with more information. For right now, we're a wonder series. I told people last time, Nikola Tesla's favorite number is 369. And there's some mathematical magic behind it. You should Google him and you will want to be part of anything called 369. I'm so pleased today to be able to introduce Suzanne, who has been on this early years journey with me for 20 years as a Council of Champion members with the United Way. And I don't know, I think we look pretty good still, Suzanne, for all the time that we have been putting into trying to change the world for children and families in our community. Suzanne, though, comes with, oh my goodness, I come with lots of passion and enthusiasm and commitment to the cause, but Suzanne comes with credentials that I could only ever hope to have, because when she walks in a room, she is wise like no other. She has committed her career to caring about children and families. And what I love about Suzanne is that she's a real researcher, right? Like she really wants to ask the questions and figure out what's happening and then work with and through community to ensure that the learnings come to life. And that is such a gift for us to have someone who has all the smarts to figure out so many of these big questions that we have, but actually wants to translate it so that the rest of us can do better, be more informed. So Suzanne, I have a big bio for you, which I haven't read from, but currently I will tell you that Suzanne is a professor at the Departments of Pediatrics and Community Health with the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. And what I really love is that she is a fellow with Max Bell and the Burns Memorial Fund around natural supports. And this is a really important body of work, especially when we're talking about community and children and families. Suzanne is an award recipient for all kinds of amazing things, the University of Alberta Alumni Award of Excellence, the Global YWCA Women of Vision, and she is such. The United Nations She Innovates. Who wouldn't want to have such an award? Very cool. You are fortunate today to get to hear Suzanne present, I'd say not good news, but something that will hopefully call us all to action. And that's what these 369 series are all about, is trying to mobilize our community to do more. Suzanne is joined by Sheila, and Sheila too is one of these researchers who really want to make it real so that we can all just do better. So thank you for joining us today. And Suzanne, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy. I hardly know where to begin, except for I've really enjoyed the chance to settle into the meeting that Elder Wallace provided, with sort of grounding us in the remembrance that we are the community. And what I'm going to share today with all of you is about all of us. And so just to recognize that, as Stacy mentioned, Sheila McDonald is here with me today. She co-leads the All Our Families research team that I lead. And Sherry Madigan is also here today with us, another researcher on our team that has particular expertise in screen time. We would love to entertain your questions through chat, and those that we don't get to today, certainly I can encourage us to respond to and get redistributed through Stacy and the network. So really the best outcome of sharing this information is that we get to talk about what we're learning and learn together about what we can do about some of the findings that I'm going to share from the All Our Families cohort. Now we're going to have a technical thing here where Sheila's going to load up her screen and start our slides off here.
Okay.
And so
Can you see my screen? Okay.
Okay,
We're ready to go.
well, we're launched. The technology is working, and we're going to talk for about 30 to 35 minutes today, maybe a little less, but look forward to the conversation. So we're going to talk about the experiences of families during COVID-19. And I'd like to acknowledge that in addition to Sheila and Sherry, there's a number of talented scientists that are helping us try to understand what we're learning about families in urban communities today. Next slide, please, Sheila. So what are we going to learn? Well, it's always nice to have a few objectives so I can stay focused on what's happening. And we're going to describe what we're seeing with maternal mental health, describe how children and youth are doing, and also suggest some strategies to remediate some of the stresses that COVID is revealing in our neighborhoods. Next slide. And a bit of a background about the data. So the data was collected under the Alberta Burst Common Data Initiative, which is supported by the Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation. This is a collaborative between two longitudinal pregnancy cohorts, All Our Families and Apron, where we've worked together to collect core common data from our participants over time. This graphic illustrates the timeline of data collection for both cohorts. We recruited pregnant women who signed up understanding that we wanted to study them and their babies over time to see how biology interacted with the social environment to influence maternal and child health. The first infant was recruited into All Our Families in 2008 and into Apron a year later. We've completed the 8-year follow-up phase for over 5,000 families with about a 70% retention rate. This is the platform that enabled us to respond quickly to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So we've collected biologic samples like blood and urine, and participants have completed detailed questionnaires about everything from their diet to their living conditions, to stress levels, and to how their children are doing. When we responded to COVID-19, it was to understand how families are coping in the short term, but because we have data from the long term, we can look at what changes consequent to COVID. So what factors would have identified the families that were most at risk of having challenging circumstances right now in the pandemic? So I'm going to share findings from our survey that was completed between May and July 2020, which reflected what was happening 3 months into the pandemic. So who's in our study? These families all have at least one child in elementary school. And prior to the pandemic, approximately 86% had a family income over $80,000 per year. The majority were married, had post-secondary education, and were Caucasian. So these families reflect the parenting population of many urban centers in Canada. These families are building careers, supporting their children in developing life skills that they'll need for the future, and carrying on in their life. Next slide. These families are engaging in hobbies and household projects, and the findings I'm going to share represent the best case scenario, because you're going to see that compared to past data, the most vulnerable participants were less likely to respond. So mathematically, that means that we are underestimating the effect of COVID across the whole population. So our data is very accurate for what we see, but it might be worse than I'm going to tell you today in some areas. So what happened? Financial impact. This is something that we've all talked about and maybe have had experiences in our own family or neighborhood, and our data can quantify it. So 58% of families experienced a reduction in income or job loss. In 20% of families, both income earners lost their jobs. 43% of families indicate they're impacted in their ability to meet existing financial obligations, and 5% report food insecurity. And those families that had lower incomes at the outset were more likely to report financial impact. Essentially, the vulnerable have become more vulnerable. And how has this impacted moms' mental health? Moms reported on their mental health, and the findings reveal that 35% are experiencing symptoms of anxiety and or depression, of which many are new cases. You'll see here that 17% of mothers experienced depression pre-pandemic. 35% of mothers are scoring at risk of depression in the pandemic. 23% of mothers are scoring high on our anxiety scales in the pandemic, compared to about 17% pre-pandemic. 78% of mothers report that managing the demands are difficult. They are struggling to assist with schoolwork, their own work, and household tasks. Mothers often have assumed the responsibility of employee, parent, partner, house cleaner, cook, teacher, and playmate. These experiences reflect the challenges of the pandemic. And for example, we know that mental health is worse among those coping with multiple demands. For example, 44% of those who find it difficult to secure childcare are depressed, compared to those who are finding it easier to secure childcare. Next slide, please. So we asked the mothers to tell us how they were feeling, and what they said was, the toughest part is that I'm actually working more, given the computer is right there all the time. Managing that has been something I actually have to focus on. The guilt that as a working parent who's also homeschooling, I'm not being the best parent or the best employee that I can be. We're not doing very well. We're dealing with the financial and mental challenges and the child's behavior issues and regressions. We are trying our best to adjust ourselves to the new lifestyle. So when we look at how mental health has changed over time and the variability among those who are financially impacted or less impacted, this slide highlights some of our findings. So I mentioned earlier, at the 5-year follow-up, the rates of depression and anxiety were about 16%. In the pandemic, among those financially impacted, 36% have symptoms of depression and 28% have symptoms of anxiety. In the pandemic, among those not financially impacted, 31% have symptoms of depression and 22% have symptoms of anxiety. I'll just pause here to draw your attention to the fact that even if you are not financially impacted, your likelihood of depression is much greater than it was pre-pandemic. So the best case scenario is 30% of our mothers are struggling with mood challenges. Next slide, please. Many of us have heard about vaccines and we're eager to get the vaccines, and we're really actually pretty eager to see what's going to unfold in our country around vaccine availability. And we asked mothers if they intended to vaccinate their children if a COVID-19 vaccine was approved. 69% of families said yes, and 5% said no, and 31% are unsure. I want to draw your attention to the 31% who are unsure, because this does not represent those who were vaccine hesitant in the past. There is no difference in those who are unsure among those who have full vaccine compliance or less vaccine compliance. Another way of saying that is that 85% of our families were compliant with the existing vaccine schedule. And so we have high vaccine compliance for these families in general, yet 31% at this point in time are unsure about having their child vaccinated. And you might ask, why would that be? Or you might have your own ideas or your own concerns. So the reasons that our families said they might be hesitant is uncertainty around the safety and efficacy of the vaccine, some concern about the long-term safety, and some concern about the quality of testing or the process being too abbreviated. This is important because many of you are probably in careers or professions where vaccine reluctance can limit the ability of the children and families you work with to engage in the resources that are going to become available. Next slide, please. So what did the youth tell us? For the very first time ever, all our families was able to ask youth what they were experiencing during COVID instead of relying on mothers to tell us how their children were doing. And I'm going to share a few slides around our youth. I think that's a key interest of our audience today. But I want to reassure you that when we compare what youth say to what their mothers said on similar or identical questions, we have very high congruence. So the good news is mothers actually do know what their children are doing, and that we can rely on families to really share information honestly, because there's not much difference between what the child says and what the mother says. And I say mother in this as the primary caregiver, and because most of the participants in our study, as I mentioned, are mothers, because we recruited these families when the mom was pregnant. So, uses of digital devices. Well, 56% sometimes use a digital device before bed, and an additional 25% always use a digital device before bed. When we asked youth about sleep, 25% of them were getting less than the suggested 9 hours of sleep a night. When we asked about physical activity, we're happy to report that 75% were exercising or moving around daily, but less than half were meeting the physical activity guidelines of 60 minutes a day. Next slide, please. Youth also told us, which will be interesting for this audience, that 57% of them are reading for fun daily. So activities outside of what they're required to do for school. In terms of creative play, 25% are creating plays, stories, or acting weekly, and 48% are spending time doing arts and crafts at least weekly. In terms of outdoors and exposure to our green environment, 51% are exploring nature weekly. Next slide, please. The at-home school environment is a tricky one, and we've heard a lot about this on the media. And I think it's important to highlight here that 46% of our youth always or almost always found it easy to do their schoolwork at home. 81% have told us that they almost always or always have enough help from their parents. And over half, at 53%, almost always or always have enough help from their teacher. In terms of what are the challenges with the school environment, if we look at this information here, you can see that 7% are never finding it easy to do school work at home, and 16% say, well, it's a little bit easy. So this 23% that is struggling or potentially struggling with doing school work at home is a group we want to pay attention to. In terms of help from parents, 1% say they've never had enough help, and 5% are saying, well, they had a little bit of help from parents, and potentially more would be helpful. In terms of help from teachers, 10% are saying they've never had enough help, and 19% say they're getting a little bit of help. So as you can see, we're getting a constellation of information that says, in general, the majority of children are doing quite well. However, there is a proportion of children who I'm wondering are not slipping further and further away from being able to meet the academic expectations and the social and emotional expectations that are going to be required for them to thrive going forward. And we'll have a chance to talk about that at the end. Next slide, please. This is work led by Sherry Madigan on children and screen time, and we have an interest in screen time in our research team. So compared to 18 months ago, pre-pandemic, we see an understandable increase in screen time of 90 minutes a day for average weekly screen time use of about 22 hours outside of school computer use. In families where financial and psychological stress is high, children's screen time use is more elevated. So you might be interested to know that both mothers and youth agreed on the youth of screen time, just like they did on participation in other activities. So what are the things that can help youth? Well, a family media plan reduced screen use by about 6 hours a week. And children who use screens for social connection had lower overall screen use. So social connection would be connecting to a friend or connecting to a grandparent or using your technology to stay connected. So there's some good news about families. About 50% of parents report feeling closer to their children, and more than 25% report more closeness with their partner. 44% of our children and youth feel closer to their parents, and 46% of youth feel closer to their siblings. So there will be some opportunities that families are creating memories for the future, learning new skills, and actually getting to know each other better during the pandemic than they might have before. Next slide. Family well-being, and we looked at hobbies and school. And so I've shared some of what you said in terms of how they're spending their time. And just to kind of abbreviate here, 60% report an increase in hobbies, 90% report doing more household projects and activities, 95% of children are doing more chores, and 74% of mothers report their child is keeping up with their school work. In sharing the data about chores, some of you might be laughing, saying, well, I haven't seen that in my family, but it actually does seem to be consistent that at least once a week, children are doing more than they used to do. And in a proportion of those, children are actually doing chores or activities to help the family daily. What moms told us. Well, apart from the finances, everything else is great. Lots of family time, relaxation, house chores, and general cleaning and maintenance are getting done, which are things that we don't usually have the time to do. It has been easier to connect with friends that don't live nearby, those in different time zones, by video chatting. I've been able to discover my son's pitching in attitude and my daughter's creative ability. There are challenges during COVID. Families struggling the most are characterized by both a loss of income combined with challenges balancing demands associated with home and school. Families with lower incomes pre-pandemic were more likely to report a financial impact in the pandemic. Essentially, a double hit with fewer resources and more responsibility. I'm going to pause because I see a question from Phil coming up in the chat line about, well, where are the dads? Phil, I can share with you that we don't actually have personal responses from fathers. And there's a research reason for that. After we recruit the mothers into the study, we have only consent to contact the mothers. If we were to contact the fathers to ask them how they're feeling, the challenge we face methodologically is then the mother becomes the gatekeeper to the father. And so we have a suspicion that mothers who would ask the partner, male or otherwise, to complete the questionnaire wouldn't represent the full spectrum of parents out there who are assuming a fathering role. But it's a very important question, and one that, given time and resources, we'd love to have more information on fathers. And specifically to your question, it is highly likely that fathers' mental health is suffering as well. And I don't know the magnitude. Maybe Sherry at the end might have some advice on that from her psychological perspective or perspective as a psychologist. Okay, let's move on. So what we've learned, the pandemic has impacted everyone. And I'm just going to reiterate this here because I think it's really important to note that families that are trying to balance too much could easily be at a tipping point. We call that cumulative stress, and the stresses have accumulated. So what can we do to help our families, help the people that we care for and care about during COVID? Well, we've got 3 R's here to consider. We can help establish routines for sleep, meals, recreation, school, and other activities. The benefit of a routine is that it reduces decision-making fatigue and frees up resources for complex decisions. And it also helps children thrive. So the more things we have to decide on in a day, the more energy we expend. And we use that energy, whether we're deciding what to make for breakfast or whether we're deciding how to make a decision at work or a decision about whether to let our children go out and play. So routines can reduce the taxing effort on the mind for those decisions. We can look at resources, and we can see how we can help create financial and structural resources. So a fair amount of the stress that families are facing has to do with, first off, the challenges with creating routine with school closures, but also the concern that there will not be structural resources to help them manage the activities of daily living, like childcare. When we can manage these resources, we reduce physiological stress response, we enable job stability, and we can facilitate skill development, which is actually one of the ways through a crisis like this, is building skills. Our 3rd R is relationship, and we can make a commitment to social connections. And Stacy started us off on a nice note around that, and I'm going to continue to talk about the benefit of social connections. Social connections matter because they increase the feel-good hormone oxytocin. They normalize difficult experiences when we share things that are challenging with others around us. It increases our sense of belonging, which is really important for community cohesion and mental health, and relationships improve mood. So let's talk a little bit more about the social snack. And this builds on work from my policy fellowship around how we can create opportunities that we can all engage in to improve outcomes for all of us, actually. So a social snack is a brief, informal, positive interaction that contributes to happiness, a sense of belonging, and identity. You have a brief social snack. Next slide, please. When you say hello or wave to your neighbor, when you smile with your eyes over your mask, or when you chat with somebody in the dog park. When you listen to somebody tell their story, your brain and their brain feel better because the interaction reduces our stress hormones and releases, as I said before, the feel-good hormones. So take a moment and smize, pick up the phone and make a phone call, and challenge yourself or your family to a few social snacks a day. Next slide, please. Just as much as we need to take care of our kids, we also need to practice self-care so that we can present and care for our children even better. Our kids are watching us and how we react. Taking care of ourselves improves our outlook, which can also influence our children's outlook. And it provides a role model for how to address challenging circumstances. I want to comment that one of the challenges of implementing the 3 R's of routine, resources, and relationships is that the 4th R, reward, can sometimes seem distant. When the reward is distant, sometimes it's hard to motivate ourselves to take action. Knowing this, and knowing that even social snacking takes practice, can help you when we're learning new habits. So in summary, there's many, many families with children that are challenged in navigating daily activities during the pandemic. For many families, stress is very high, and we're all hoping on our team that this information can provide insight for those developing resources to reduce the impact of financial, parental, partnership, and mental health strains. Our data and that of others has consistently revealed that the ability to engage with social support really matters, fosters resilience, improves outcomes. And so there's opportunities to think of how this information can be helpful in your daily practice. We can remind parents that time and attention and shared activities like reading and playing together are more valuable than things when it comes to helping children thrive now and always. I'd like to recognize the significant funding that we have in keeping the All Our Families cohort going for well over a decade now, and couldn't have done it without the financial support of our funders. And you can reach us easily through social media and online. And just the final slide to remind everybody that this is really a large team of people, and I'm the spokesperson today, and we look forward to answering your questions and hearing your ideas. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Sheila, if you don't mind, if you can stop sharing the presentation, then we can see more, more of each other. So I'm just going to facilitate a bit of Q&A. Thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, there's been a couple of things going through the chat, and if there's more questions, please feel free to put them in. You know, I think as you brought up the slides of the numbers, I think, of people and how they're being affected, just comments of how it's maybe a little bit disturbing to see those numbers that they're, I think, quite stark in understanding where we're at. I think to see that, you know, people maybe experiencing depression have doubled, and that those individuals may not have had that experience of depression previously, I think is probably something we're all seeing a little bit of in our lives with the people around us or with ourselves. So as I was thinking more about the research that you do in the All Our Families cohort and things, it's interesting, your research, because I feel like we often talk about things in silos. So we talk about children or addressing children, or we talk about, but we don't always talk about the interconnections. And so I was wondering if you could speak maybe a little bit more, talk about the benefits of acknowledging that interrelated connection between parents' well-being and children, and maybe talk a little bit about how that changes outcomes for children potentially.
Sure, Jacqueline, I'm happy. So if I understand the question, you're wanting me to clarify that when mom's mental health is better and when father's mental health is better, it's easier for children to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so part of that is, and one of the benefits of public health is, if I say anything that doesn't make sense, then it can't be true, because public health is about all of us. And so I think it should be generalizable. We should be able to see ourselves in these ideas and in this data. So when mom and dad are struggling with financial challenges and lack of time to do the things that they feel would be helpful for themselves and their family, it's easy to trigger challenges with mood, or vice versa. It doesn't have to be unidirectional. None of this ever is, which is sort of the complexity of a platform like this. But it is true that when we're not feeling well, it's maybe harder to attend to the needs of those around us. because there's an energy cost to that behavior of engagement. So it's much easier to have patience and persistence that it takes to parent and boundaries when you're feeling well about yourself. So if part of it is, how do we help families create these? Those are ideas linked to things like family plans. Something that Sherry has often talked about is families having media plans, or families having strategies that enable them all to try to thrive during a difficult time. Specifically, we know that when mothers have severe mental health concerns, there can be challenges to child development, but there's lots of buffers, so it's not deterministic. So children can thrive in good environments outside the nuclear home when school settings are healthy and supportive, neighborhoods are healthy and supportive, and children with threats to development are identified early in childcare or other systems so that the resources can be made available to help them move through to their own successes.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that strikes a chord for myself and my own children. There's definitely moments of like getting to the end of the rope, and then, you know, I just can't deal quite the same way as at the beginning of the day. You know, it's like my willpower is really high when I wake up in the morning, but it's a lot less high, you know, maybe when I'm having that chocolate bar at 9 o'clock at night or something like that. You know, that there's definitely a peaks and valley moment. In that. I was thinking too, you know, kind of around Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. And when you were talking about the familial closeness being increased, and I thought, you know, for myself, you know, I could speak to my own experience of like, yes, I can feel that in my own home to a degree, but I feel like there's still quite a loss of that greater community around me, you know, the familial kind of, and I don't know if you've had any feedback on that in the work that you've been doing lately, or that you can speak to yourself.
If the question is it enough to just have family without community? The answer is no. I think we thrive in the context of where we grow and work and learn and play. So yes, the absence of being able to connect, I think, is really something that we need to pay attention to. And that's why all of the ideas that we have around natural supports, social snacking, reaching out, are really crucial for helping us remember we're part of a larger community. And one of the tricks that happens is when we put on the mask, sometimes we forget that we can still say hello in the grocery store, or we forget that there's no barrier to showing empathy to the father with 2 children screaming in the grocery cart, because he's not really happy to be there either. And to just recognize that a little bit of empathy and compassion can go a long way when we're spread so thin. So the spreading thin is what's happening to the nuclear families, because they don't have the resources and supports that they might have had in the past for activities for their children that were also learning and skill development opportunities for their children, whether it was Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, or competitive hockey. Like the whole range of things helps our children thrive in our society.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the idea of the social snacking. Can't say I've heard that term before, but I do. There's a thrill I get these days of just walking my kids to school and making eye contact with other human beings outside my home. So there's something it resonated with me greatly. Phil here just noted how much he appreciates your research. But also asking, do you see that there can be a case made that what we need is also resources to provide proactive, preventative initiatives so all children can thrive and reach their full potential? And I'll throw that to you, Suzanne, but Stacey, I don't know if you want to jump in on that at all as well.
So Phil's question is about proactive addressing of these
preventative initiatives so all children can thrive and reach their full potential.
Well, thanks for the question, Phil. Yes. I mean, the whole framework of our program is how do we understand what's happening early in the lives of children that would help us identify them and intervene before they had the experiences of feeling like a failure or not reaching their potential. So, so I have lots of passion for the best use of our resources would be to try to level the playing field as early as possible in all children's lives. So one of the concerns, and we haven't had this data long enough to nuance it, but if Stacy asks us back in 8 months, I think one of the nuances is how do we really understand these children that could be at the tipping point where remedial attention is not going to be sufficient to get them back into reaching their potential. So, so yes.
Yeah, I'll jump in maybe, Suzanne, I like the question, Phil. But so our next steps are actually to follow these families up throughout the pandemic. So we're going to be looking at trends over time, how the kids who are not doing that great at baseline, how are they doing 8 months into the pandemic, whatnot. But the cool thing about our data is that we can really link back to the early years and identify those families, children whose developmental trajectories might be going okay, but then they might fall off, or who's most at risk and that sort of thing. So I think we can be proactive and look at those early identifying markers. So I just wanted to let the audience know that we're continuing to follow up these families. Actually, we're launching our next COVID survey in the next week, probably. And we're getting some really interesting information. We're going to be accessing some interesting information on children's mental health, very detailed information. The youth, their voices speaking again to us. And so it's really exciting for us because the one snapshot in time is we're just giving you some descriptive stats. We have maybe some relative stats, but we can really tease apart what's going on over the long term for these families.
Thanks for jumping in there, Sheila. Yeah, I think that actually leads into a question from Sharon that she put in the chat that says, is there any anticipated long-term impact to children, mental or social? And are these impacts increased if they are older?
I think we'll have to say from our data, we don't know that because we haven't looked long term. I don't know, Sherry, if you'd like to hypothesize what you would expect. I think there's going to be some children that struggle and other children that don't. And the opportunity is going to be to make sure we get the resources to those that are most at risk. But Sherry, do you have an idea?
Well, I think it goes back to maybe saying, can we come back in 8 months? Because we could tell you a little bit more, even maybe sooner, because we're actually just about to look at the mental health data. And I think it's really important what Sheila was saying, putting the data that Suzanne so sort of beautifully talked about today, is that was, 3 months into the pandemic. I was home with my 4 kids, homeschooling, like life felt very different then. So I think it's great that we're following these families up again, because I think circumstances, while have, become challenging for some people, some families may be doing better now that there's a bit of more stability in the family unit in terms of kids going to school. I think that we might see differences in how kids were also doing at the beginning of the pandemic when they weren't allowed to be with their friends, and their social connections and those really important pieces that Suzanne talked about. And now that they're back at school, I think one of the things we can see is how important that might be for their mental health to be around their peers. These guys are 9 to 11. This is like a really ripe developmental age, not only when mental health is sort of on the sort of unfolding for them, but where their peer relationships take on more primacy. So I think that we'll know a lot more as we kind of see how kids are doing now that they're back in school and they're with their peers and they're getting those social interactions in place. I think will be sort of really telling. And I think in the same way that we have seen that I'm expecting kids' mental health to have improved from potentially the first time we talked to kids in the pandemic. I'm expecting parent mental health will probably have improved as well, I hope, because I think that with that more stability in the family structure with kids going to school, I think when we can everyone's been saying, we need to get the kids back in school. It's really good for their well-being. And I think it's really good for parent well-being when the kids are back in school too. So I think it'll be interesting, just to see their trajectory over the course of this pandemic.
Definitely. Thanks for that. Yeah, Stacey, what were you going to add to that?
I was just, I think in those early days, we did see this educational upheaval that was really anxiety enhancing. But how can we get a sense of, I don't find very many people are talking about what about these pandemic babies that have been born in extreme social isolation, who really have not been exposed to anyone. We know how foundational the brain is in those developmental stages. So will your new research also look at these before school children, and in particular these infants that were born during this time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Stacey. And our cohort will not look at that because our children are growing up. But based on my experience in the children's world, which of course we were embedded in when we started the cohort, and I think there's lots of places to be reassured that our children will be fine if we pay attention to their needs as they unfold as we can. So children have the opportunity to be quite resilient and to continue learning across their life course. So will some infants have consequences because of limited developmental exposure in their own environment? Yes, and that's not a very good thing. But the majority of families, I think, are doing very well and trying their best to follow the guidelines for interaction with children and interaction with peers to the best of their ability. So we see childcares are open, daycares are open. We're trying to get kids into preschool and kindergarten. Small infants, there's of course a small developmental window when more is better. It's not like an infant that has an attentive parent is going to be perpetually limited by, I wouldn't imagine, I can't, from what I know of the science to date and what our data showed earlier around preterm infants and infants with developmental challenges, there's still lots of reason to be optimistic.
Thanks for that, Suzanne. And I just want to get to Michelle's question from the chat. She was just wondering maybe if you're familiar with or maybe some other studies or other data that talks more about experiences of families with complicating factors. And she just kind of mentions those that maybe didn't complete post-secondary or secondary education or has a family income of less than 80,000. And just saying that, especially in the context of COVID, where many of these more vulnerable parents / caregivers are probably thinking more about ensuring basic needs and have significantly less energy to think about other social needs.
Well, I really appreciate the question because it gives me a chance to clarify that those families are still represented in our data. They just don't make up the majority of participants in our data set. So that's where the underestimation comes from. But they do represent what we see in Calgary in terms of the bell curve of families. And that's one of the most if anybody has any idea about how our team can be better at explaining it, when you look at population health, we include everybody, not just targeted clinical populations. So the more specific answer to that question is those families are more vulnerable. And even though I said in my last response that we can be optimistic for the majority of children, it doesn't mean there are not children in a group that are going to benefit from intensive resources and more opportunity to level the playing field. So those families that the question came from that are financially challenged, maybe challenged by language barriers or lack of familiarity with the Canadian system, or they're challenged by job loss. 20% have lost all income in the family. Those families are really the ones we need to be alert to, because of course their attention then needs to be on physical security. And that's why resources like financial stability and access to structure as our communities open up will be essential for those families to re-engage.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And thank you so much for you and your team for answering the questions today. I'm going to turn the time over to Stacey to close us out.
So in the 369 series, this hour has 69 minutes, and we're down to the final 5 minutes that we have committed for you to be on this call. I want to thank Suzanne and Sheila for being here today, and Sherry for also being here. You look like we have double Suzanne Toughs, just like we have double Stacey's on the Zoom platform here. Thank you for continuing, and absolutely we want you back in 8 months' time so that you can tell us more about what you're learning. For those of you on the call, I'm hoping that you already have in your calendars our next 369 session. They are always held on the 3rd workday of the 3rd week of the month. So March 17th, you are going to be so happy to come and hear Lori from PolicyWise, who is going to be able to reassure you that if you read during this time, it's incredibly good for your mental well-being and for your children's well-being. So today we heard, sort of about the situation that many of us find ourselves in and our families are in. And you're going to hear about some other things like talk is free and you can do it all the time, and read, because it's really making you feel good. So we look forward to next month, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Go read a great book.
Thanks, Stacey. Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.